This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today, science masquerades as magic. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim was born in Switzerland in 1493, but he called himself Paracelsus. He learned medicine from his father. He learned metallurgy as a lad working in the mines. He became a wandering scholar. Paracelsus took up the alchemy behind medicine and metallurgy. He rejected Aristotle's science. Knowledge, he claimed, is born in the mind, not in nature. He adopted the language of arcana and magic. He was difficult at best, going from town to town, offending people till they threw him out. Once he wrote, "I am greater than those to whom you liken me. I can prove to you what you cannot prove. Each little hair on my neck knows more than you and all your scribes." He nearly settled in Basel when he was 34. The great early printer, Frobenius, was ill. No other physician could help him, so he turned to Paracelsus. Frobenius must have been desperate, yet Paracelsus cured him. Next, Paracelsus became physician to the scholar Erasmus. He found a place in Basel. But within a year, he lit a bonfire in front of the university and threw the standard medical text into it. He might have survived the faculty's rage, but then Frobenius died after all. When he did, Paracelsus' protection died with him. He spent the last 14 years of his life wandering. Governments banned his books. Yet, in the end, he conquered history. He became the most famous alchemist of them all. A huge sanity lurked under all his madness. He told doctors to be far more careful in dosing people with mercury. He began reshaping the essences of earth, air, fire, and water into a concept of chemical elements. He told his followers to monitor medicine more carefully and to analyze symptoms. Creative people see Paracelsus' secret. He fit no mold. He was not Aristotelian, nor Platonic, nor a witch doctor. Oh, he spoke in the language of Platonic ideals and magic. But the magic he helped us see was really the magic of nature itself. He used his eyes as well as his head. We would have forgotten him, but he left a legacy that would not be forgotten. He'd written in German instead of Latin. As people turned to the new medium of print, they hungered for books they could read, so they read Paracelsus. It was the printers who saved him after all. 300 years later, modern atomic theory grew out of changes he'd set in motion. So did modern medical science. And we're left with a hard message. Creative people don't look the way we want them to look. One way or another, they're always a trouble to our mind because they take us where we hadn't meant to go. I'm John Lienhardt at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today, we meet a great 20th century inventor. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. In 1957, I ran a lab experiment for students at Berkeley. We measured stress distributions in loaded plates made from clear plastic. We shone polarized light through the plate. The rays continued through another sheet of unstressed Polaroid plastic. The result was a sort of Rorschach picture in colored bands. The bands made a contour map of the stresses in the plate. They gave us a shortcut around some terrible mathematics. That was just one of 100 uses for Polaroid plastics. The Polaroids are light filters. Normally, light coming at you vibrates in two directions, say left, right, and up, down. The Polaroids remove light that vibrates in one of those directions. We knew about polarization 180 years ago. Then, around 1930, several things happened. A woman named Helen Maislin studied physics at Smith College. Her professor there coined the term Polaroid. Soon she married Edwin Land, a young physics student who'd been turned on by courses at Norwich College. Land went on to Harvard, but he got so engrossed with polarization that he dropped out. In 1937, Land formed a company to produce a new polarizing plastic. Of course, he named it Polaroid. By 1943, he was a 34-year-old business wunderkind, now on vacation in Santa Fe. When he took snapshots of his family, his 3-year-old daughter complained, "Why do we have to wait so long to see the pictures?" Why, indeed. That afternoon, Land walked through the old town chewing on the question. We shouldn't have to wait. During that walk, he invented the Polaroid camera in his head. The camera was based on a new film that developed and printed immediately. At first, Land got sepia images. By 1950, he had a black and white system. He'd invented a color Polaroid camera by 1959, and it was on the market in 1963. Of course, these Polaroid cameras had nothing to do with polarized light. Land had gone off in an entirely new direction. By the late 60s, half the households in America had Polaroid cameras of one sort or another. When Land retired in 1982, he was a 73-year-old billionaire with 533 patents to his name. Land was a reticent and driven man. Once he said, "Anything worth doing is worth doing to excess." That upsets our ideas about moderation and balance, yet it also recalls an old biblical idea. "Because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I will spew you from my mouth." Well, there was nothing lukewarm about the way Land threw himself at invention. He reminds us that invention is a passion. It lies too near the human heart to be done with any kind of circumspection. I'm John Lienhardt at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today, I learn about more than DNA. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. Robert Hazen and James Trefil are two scientists who've been studying scientific illiteracy. Hazen recently spoke to a group of geophysicists. He asked them to distinguish between RNA and DNA. Only 2 out of 25 could. I also came up short. I didn't know the difference either. I knew that the very nature of our being is vested in them, but how? Hazen exposed a huge scientific illiteracy in my own life. He had my attention. Maybe those of us who work in science and technology are our own worst enemies. We often lay claim to ignorance of anything but our own area. It seems that by knowing heat transfer, I'd let myself be ignorant of biology. So I put the question to a biochemist. He began by reciting the structure of the DNA molecule. My first reaction was to cut him off. I wasn't interested in organic chemistry. I only wanted the answer. But then I relaxed and paid attention. A biochemist was sharing his knowledge on his terms. To understand, I had to meet him there. He was absolutely right. I had to hear him out. If I didn't come to terms with details, I would know nothing. DNA is a wonderfully elegant molecule. It's also very stable. RNA is only slightly different. It's less stable. RNA presents the information from DNA in an interactive form. RNA puts the DNA code to work, making protein for our cells. It shapes those cells for the brain or muscles, blood or skin. DNA is the archival record of our being. It's carried in every cell of our body. RNA is the working copy of that record. DNA is like the American Constitution buried in a Washington vault. RNA is like the working law. It's fractional and varied, but it always reflects that document in the vault. From the biochemist, I went to a biophysicist. She told me about the human genome and the structure of genes and chromosomes. After just 2 hours spent patching my ignorance, I emerged far richer. I came away with renewed awe for the majesty of human life. I came away reminded that scientific knowledge is not a secret, but we ourselves often believe it is. We intimidate one another. I've known laymen far better equipped to speak across the lines we draw than we are. Hazen and Trefil tell us we won't achieve scientific literacy when we wall ourselves off from each other. Scientific literacy means believing that we can understand what we don't know. We have to role model that belief, that curiosity, and that confidence before we can ask it of the general public. I'm John Lienhard at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today, science fiction forges a weapon of war. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. If you think war drives technology, maybe you should look at German rocketry. The German Army ordered a study of rockets in 1929. It began building rockets the next year. That sounds like great foresight. I suppose it was, but it had nothing to do with the Nazis. Hitler didn't take over until 4 years later. By 1929, the American Goddard and the Russians had worked with rockets. The German military didn't tumble to any of that. Something else happened. We have to go back to 1923, when Hermann Oberth published a book on rocketry. Oberth laid out the principles of modern spaceflight. He said rockets could escape Earth's atmosphere. They could even escape gravity. They could carry people, and they could turn a profit. He wasn't talking about war. The book was to have been his doctoral dissertation, but the faculty at Heidelberg rejected it. Rockets won't work in the vacuum of space, a professor claimed, because they have nothing to push against. Then a science fiction writer named Max Valier got his hands on Oberth's book. He became Oberth's champion. Writings on spaceflight began flowing from his pen. Valier arrested public attention. For a while, Valier and Oberth collaborated, but Valier didn't really understand rocketry. He tried to improve on Oberth's hard facts. Oberth had to end their collaboration. But no matter, the spark had landed in the tinder of the 1920s imagination. By 1928, Valier's enthusiasm had caught the air of the Opel automobile fortunes. The fellow built a series of rocket-powered cars. Then he flew a rocket-powered glider. Meanwhile, Fritz Lang stopped work on the movie Metropolis to make a film about flying to the moon. In the midst of all this, a German officer read Oberth's book. Only then did he start the machinery of military rocketry. By 1930, we find a photo of the military rocket group. Oberth stands in front of a small rocket. On the right, we see an 18-year-old lad holding a fitting. His clear, alert face gazes transfixed, not at Oberth, but at the rocket. The young engineer is Werner von Braun. 14 years later, V-2 rockets began falling on English civilians. They weren't the fruit of military vision at all. They were born in Oberth's science and Valier's fiction. They were born in the face of young von Braun, dreaming about flying to the moon. I'm John Lienhard at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today, a black immigrant provides shoes for America. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. Jan Matzeliger lived less than 37 years. Most of them were lonely ones. He was born in Dutch Guiana in 1852. His father was a white engineer, his mother a black slave. As a boy, he apprenticed in a machine shop. Quiet and fiercely intelligent, Matzeliger put to sea in a merchant ship when he was 19. His travels took him at last to Lynn, Massachusetts. There he worked as a shoe stitching machine operator. He had tough going. Not only was he black, but his native tongue was Dutch. The Catholic, Unitarian, and Episcopal churches gave him a cold shoulder, so he took up residence inside his own head. He read and studied. He also thought about the most difficult step in making shoes. First, you sewed the shoe top together. Next, you shaped the top over a wooden model of a human foot, called a last. Then you sewed the top to the inner sole. It took great skill to bend, shape, and hold the leather while you stitched it to the bottom. The shoe machine people had invested huge sums in trying to mechanize that step. They'd failed. Matzeliger knew he could solve the problem. He began creating a working model. He scrounged parts and went without food so he could pay for materials. All this on top of 10-hour work days. It took 5 years, but by 1882 he'd filed a patent. It was a huge, complex 15-page document. 2 businessmen funded the prototype in exchange for 2/3 of any profits. By 1855, Matzeliger had a production model ready. At that point, he sold out for $15,000. He went on to new inventions while others got rich on his genius. Matzeliger's last 5 years were happy ones. He gained membership in the North Congregational Church. He gained friends. He taught Sunday school, and he taught oil painting. He also poured out his inventive genius on new machines. Meanwhile, he'd cut the cost of making shoes in 2. When tuberculosis claimed him, his will left a big piece of his fortunes to the church that had seen beyond the color of his skin. He made special provisions for his drawing instruments, his Bible, and his technical books, the things that had really mattered to him. In 1984, Lynn, Massachusetts finally named a bridge after this good and quiet man who'd done so much for the city, who'd done so much for all America. Finally, they honored this triumph of the mind against all odds. I'm John Lienhardt at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today I watch music change us. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. It's late. I'm just back from hearing the University of Chicago Motet Choir. 40 apple-cheeked, bespectacled young students ran a gamut of fine music. We heard 40 serious and slightly nerdish students full of the wonder of Hans Leo Hassler and Jakob Handel. We heard 40 budding mathematicians, philosophers, poets, and chemists. It was an eerie experience for me, for there I stood 40 years ago. The same music shaded my whole learning of thermodynamics and beam theory. It ran in my mind and tempered my life when I, too, was infinitely young. Now they sing a bird mass, the same bird mass I played in my head all through basic training. The Army took me from the university. For 2 years, the music I'd sung sustained me. My wife nudges me. Look, she whispers, they feel as though they're the first people who've discovered all that music. Well, she should know. She and I met long ago in a group singing Vaughan Williams' Poulenc and Purcell. The performance on stage is clean and in tune, but it lacks passion. Well, of course it does. Youth itself lacks passion. Passion is still hypothetical. Those singers have so much to learn. The Latin Mass is still an antiquarian exercise. What's the meaning of Dona nobis pacem, give us peace, when you've yet to suffer strife? Now they do a piece by the fine German choral composer Hugo Distler. Distler wrote during Hitler's rise. He was anti-Nazi and he suffered for it. He committed suicide when he was only 34. He expected to be drafted and couldn't bear the idea. Not even his music could sustain him in a Nazi army. Now that's drama that a 20-year-old can fathom. Suddenly the singing takes on a new dimension. It's strong stuff. And so I watch process taking place. It's the same process that shaped me. Music is molding the lives of those 40 smart young people. It is at once a window into the world and into history. It is a mirror of themselves. Next week they'll be back to their paper chase, but the medium of music will reveal things about physics and literary criticism they couldn't have seen otherwise. I know, for I've walked precisely that same road. This was an important night for me. It helped show me who I am by reminding me just where I've been. Tonight I looked back and saw the abstract power that music has had in my life and that it has had in yours. I'm John Lienhardt at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work. If you
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today, let's meet a great inventive failure, Thomas Edison. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. In 1887, Edison was 40 years old and the most celebrated inventor in the world. Behind him lay the electric light, the central power station, the phonograph, and much, much more. 1887 was the year Edison embarked on his great and largely forgotten fiasco. 10 years before, he'd found black sand while he was fishing off Long Island. It was magnetite, iron ore. That got his attention. The cost of iron was affecting the price of his new electric generators. Edison played with the problem of separating magnetite particles from beach sand and then gave it up. Now, eastern steel mills were closing and he saw opportunity. He filed new patents. He published an article on extracting iron from low-grade ore in the journal Iron Age. It might have gone no further, but an editorial called the idea Edison's Folly. That did it. Edison set up a company to build a separation plant in Ogdensburg, New Jersey. He would pulverize low-grade ore. Then he'd drop the dust down towers lined with electromagnets. They'd catch the magnetite. Edison sold stock. He invested his own fortunes. He built a huge plant and a town around it. It opened in 1891, and it was a disaster. Bearings failed on the crushing machines. Buildings collapsed. Dust clogged everything. Workers died in accidents. Edison went back to the drawing board. In 1895, he was back with new designs. This time, he produced iron, and Bethlehem Steel bought it. Meanwhile, Edison's money flowed out like water through a sieve. Then Bethlehem complained that the fire simply blew the iron dust up the furnace stack. Edison had to invent means for binding the iron into briquettes. It all seemed to come together by 1898. The process was working. He'd cut his costs from $7 a ton to $4.75. Then the great Mesabi iron range opened in northern Minnesota. Suddenly, iron cost only $3 a ton. By 1899, Edison had to close the mill for good. So, what was the legacy of Edison's folly? It's been written out of most Edison biographies, but Edison had left behind a string of important process patents. His work later showed us how to process low-grade taconite ore. Edison himself went on to revolutionize concrete production with his methods. Henry Ford picked up ideas for his assembly line from Edison's plant. Even Iron Age magazine finally granted that Edison's greatest error was being 25 years ahead of his time. So we learn an old lesson. To succeed, we first have to risk failure. Success rises from failure in peculiar ways. The message of Ogdensburg is, quite simply, dare not, win not. I'm John Lienhard at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today, a great architect ends an era. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. Here's something to think about. It was 1960 before any building in London rose as high as the medieval cathedral at Strasbourg. The Strasbourg spire rose 40 stories above the town. We made no building that high anywhere until 100 years ago. Only by adding iron and steel could we lift buildings any higher than the Gothic cathedrals. Down through the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, cathedrals became more and more grand. By the mid-1200s, they were a technological marvel, and the men who made them knew it. The 13th century Mason architect was a powerful public figure. Once he'd simply been first among peers. Now he walked with a swagger. In 1258, the maker of Notre Dame chiseled his own name in a 25-foot stone. The next generation of builders were administrators. They no longer touched stone. By 1300, the age of the Gothic cathedral had all but ended. Let's meet one of the last great medieval builders. He was Villard d'Honnecourt. By 1250, Villard had worked on many famous cathedrals. He produced no single masterpiece, but he left behind an astonishing set of sketchbooks. Those books reflect a dazzling array of interests. He was an innovator. He honeycombed Reims Cathedral with the first set of passageways. They eliminated scaffolding for building, maintenance, and firefighting. His passageways have been part of cathedrals ever since. Villard's books teem with ideas. Here's a hand warmer for the bishop to use at High Mass. There's the first European sketch of a perpetual motion machine. Perpetual motion may seem a poor reflection on Villard, but later he gives that idea another twist. He suggests lasting motion of a workable kind when he sketches the first clock escapement mechanism. Modern clocks rose out of that crude sketch to change Western thinking and Western science. Villard traveled to less developed countries. He exported the new architecture. He created intellectual ferment. Yet, by 1300, his kind had grown so grand that they killed their own greatness. They became managers of other people's ideas. They picked the fruit without tending the orchard. By 1300, that glorious era was over. And we're left to ponder our own errors. For we too create a gulf between our imagination and the clear, hard stone of making and doing. And we'll pay the same price if we don't find a way to reverse that drift. I'm John Lienhard at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today we reflect on technology and time. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. You and I agree to meet at 4:30. I show up at 4:33. I don't say anything because that's close enough to satisfy our social contract. Only after 5 minutes do you expect me to say, "Sorry, I'm late." At 10 minutes, I owe you an explanation. The freeway exit was closed. I had to go 4 miles out of my way. After 20 minutes, I have to make a full and serious apology. After 40 minutes, I'd better not show up at all. That sort of thing, so formally observed and never explicitly stated, drives people from other cultures crazy. Anthropologists list the toughest things to cope with in a foreign land. Second only to language is the way we deal with time. Now psychologists look at our view of time another way. They go into several countries and measure the pace of life. They measure the accuracy of bank clocks and how fast city dwellers walk. They time transactions in banks and post offices. They see how long people take to answer questions. Japanese keep the fastest pace. Americans are a close second. Italians and Indonesians are at the bottom of their list. Italians give long answers to your questions. Indonesians don't give a fig about setting their bank clocks. Among American cities, Boston and Kansas City are the fastest. New York is up there, of course, but we keep a faster pace here in Houston. California's laid-back reputation is deserved. The slowest pace of all is kept in Los Angeles. Finally, we look at heart disease. That's tricky because other factors are involved. Our heart's greatest enemy is tobacco, but heart disease also correlates with the pace we keep. Smokers who drive themselves are really asking for it. Now it's 4:55. I'm strolling unhurried toward our 4:30 meeting. I'm thinking about something Isaac Watts wrote. Time, what an empty vapor 'tis, and days how swift they are. Swift as an Indian arrow flies, or like a shooting star. That tension soaks through our view of time. Can we see time as an empty vapor? Or do our technologies delineate time and bind us to it? In a technology-dense world, we too often let time turn into an Indian arrow, one aimed at our heart. So the clock ticks and we ask, is time an arrow we must dodge or vapor we can ignore? If we're smart, we only live by the clock when we have to. Otherwise, we sit back and play. We know how to let time be only vapor, after all. I'm John Lienhard at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today, we meet an inventor named Albert Einstein. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. Einstein looms so large in our mythology. What was he? A scientist, mad or sober? Pure Empyrean mind or something else? Einstein fed his own myths. He used them as a shield against a public that was ready to consume him. But consider the world that gave us Einstein. His family ran an electric machinery factory in Munich. Machinery and invention were central in their lives. Einstein studied applied physics in Switzerland. Then he became a Swiss patent examiner. He plied that trade till he was 30. He was good at it. Physicists have brushed off that experience, yet Einstein never lost interest in machinery and invention. He was an expert witness in patent suits through his 30s and 40s. When he was 50, he and another famous physicist, Leo Szilard, developed a new refrigerator. Szilard was also grounded in engineering. Together, they held 8 patents. The key to their system was the electromagnetic Einstein-Szilard pump. They finally sold the idea to Germany's General Electric Company. Einstein also worked with gyro compasses. For years, a Dutch firm paid him royalties on the compass he patented in 1926. In 1935, he invented a new airplane gyro compass. To understand Einstein, to follow his clean, radical thinking in so many areas, we have to go back to that Swiss patent office. We have to remember his family's factory. Einstein knew what other physicists didn't like to admit. It is that science is only great when it is invention. Einstein once wrote about the philosopher Ernst Mach. Mach's weakness was that he thought theories arise from discovery and not from invention. Einstein knew that scientific laws aren't exterior truths at all. They're only the means we invent to keep track of nature. So we go back and read Einstein's 1905 paper on special relativity. It dances with reference to the same electric machine elements he looked at so critically in his patent office. His mental armory was well stocked with engineering tools, with spatial concepts and machine elements. Einstein was born into the new industrial world of the late 19th century. It was a world shaped by a creative vision that was visual, machine-based, and inventive. He invented the physics that we used to leave that world behind, but Einstein himself never forgot his debt to the invented world, nor to the inventive vision. I'm John Lienhardt at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today, some thoughts for Christmas Eve, 1990. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. I finished this 500th episode of the Engines of Our Ingenuity just before Christmas Eve, 1990. It is a very special Christmas for me. By now, this program has changed my life in unexpected ways. On one level, it's taken me over. It pushes out an old life and replaces it with a new one. But that's only part of the story. It is you who've wrought the largest changes. I've told 499 stories about human creativity. I've talked about how it feels to be the creative person we all want to become. You've responded by telling me that I must really be what I talk about. I get calls and letters from people who want me to do creative things, to hear their ideas, and to validate their creative nature. Of course, I'm very far from being the ideal I celebrate, but you keep saying to me in odd ways, then become the ideal. Don't stand at the water's edge, dive in. You tell me it's not enough to talk about creative risk. You tell me I must take those risks with you. My first reaction is defensive. I've done this much, how much more do you want? Then I see how that misses the point. No amount of creativity or courage ever could be enough, because the process doesn't end. Creative growth is a long uphill road. There's always another hilltop ahead. You, the inventive listener, make it clear you don't want to walk that hard road alone if you can help it. You tell me that you'll hear me if I'm on the road with you. I have to seek out the same growth and change that you do all the time. For example, when I've talked about minority inventors, you've asked, why are you doing this? What are your motives? You've told me that I must be black, that I must be female, that I must share the problem. Only then will you be convinced. If I stand outside the people and the risks I talk about, my voice will give me away. So, I finish my 500th episode both changed and chastened by a public that will not be fooled. You've proved to be as realistic as you are demanding. You know human limitation, but you also know the human capacity for growth. In the end, this program has told me what you are. It sets you up as an example to me. Your message comes home with powerful force this Christmas Eve. It is not I who call you to your creative rebirth this night. It is you who call me to mine. and I am in your debt for that. I'm John Lienhardt at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today, our appetite is too large to feed. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. The University of Washington Library looks like an unfinished Gothic cathedral. Inside are the stumps of huge steel piers. They were meant to hold a great spire. The library was to be a cathedral to books and knowledge. Soberer heads intervened before we finished this academic Notre Dame. We never built the great spire. Since then, the library has burrowed into a warren of basements and low-lying buildings instead. A librarian shows me an exhibit he recently mounted. He called it Unbuilt Washington. It picks up the theme of unresolved dreams. An eerie parade of unfinished designs marches through it. We see city transport systems, gold and copper mines, oil wells, great canal systems, and the Boeing supersonic transport. Most of the designs were serious. A few were just shell games to trap unwary investors. Others, like the unbuilt spire above me, could yet rise in reality someday. I'm awed by the daring of these designs. In 1916, an association called for a 30-mile highway tunnel under the Cascade Mountains. It would have been 3 times longer than anything built for years to come. We were just starting to drive cars in 1916, yet we already wanted a road under the mountains. The sheer magnitude of that one catches our breath. A 1950 headline says the plan to build a bridge across Puget Sound is nearing reality. By 1966, a Highway Department study proclaims that such a bridge is feasible. It also points out that we could drill a tunnel under the Sound instead. Finally, I see. This exhibit is no joke about human folly. It is a celebration of all that might have been. Consider what isn't in the exhibit. A concrete floating bridge all the way across Lake Washington seems no less mad. The reason it's not there is that 2 of them have already been built. America teems with finished works crazier than anything here. The dream of cutting a 400-mile canal across New York in 1817 was far more bizarre, yet we built the Erie Canal anyway. So I walk away from the library under a gray drizzle. I glance back over my shoulder. That great spire rises in the mists of my imagination. It is beautiful. Never mind that it's only a dream. It reminds me that dreams are the great engines that ultimately forge realities. If our reach never exceeded the thing we were sure to grasp, our technology and our lives would be poor indeed. I'm John Lienhardt at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today, Rachmaninoff becomes vice president of an airplane company. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. Igor Sikorsky was born in Russia in 1889. He was only 20 when he built his first airplane. It was a helicopter, and it was a failure. So he turned to fixed-wing airplanes. By 1917, he'd built 75 of them for the Tsar of Russia. He helped arm Russia against the Germans in World War I. He amassed considerable wealth. He also built the world's first 4-engine plane. Then he fled the Russian Revolution to America. He arrived flat broke and ready to begin again. 6 years later, he used his new savings, $800, to form the Sikorsky Aero Engineering Corporation. He began with a twin-engine, all-metal 14-passenger plane. He called it his 29A. It was his 29th design. The A simply stood for America. That plane finally wound up in Howard Hughes' hands. Hughes trimmed it to look like a German bomber, and he crashed it in the movie Hell's Angels. The 29A owed a great debt to Sergei Rachmaninoff. Rachmaninoff put $5,000 and his name behind Sikorsky. For that, Sikorsky made Rachmaninoff the vice president of his company. And how do you suppose the 29A made its first profit? Well, fittingly enough, it carried 2 pianos from New York to Washington. Sikorsky's first real successes in America were his passenger amphibians and seaplanes. By the early 1930s, Sikorsky had made the first of the famous Pan American Clippers. Yet the helicopter continued to tease his mind. He kept playing with the idea. He filed a new helicopter patent in 1935, but he needed a lighter and more powerful engine. One finally turned up, and Sikorsky gave the world its first successful helicopter in 1939. A 30-year-old failure was set right at last. So Sikorsky's seaplanes became our primary anti-submarine weapon. The first military choppers began service in 1944. And Sikorsky? Well, he lived until 1972. He was still serving as a consultant when he died. But I go back to Sergei Rachmaninoff, airplane company executive, pianist, and composer of music. In 1923, Rachmaninoff wove a haunting melody around the words of Pushkin. "O cease thy singing, maiden fair, those songs of Georgian land, I pray thee. Whate'er recall our life to me on foreign strand, I fain would banish." Maybe the helicopter was Sikorsky's flicker of a backward glance at happier times in Georgian lands. Yet both these great Americans really did banish the old life and put a new kind of energy into this adopted land. I'm John Lienhardt at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today we learned from a game of intellectual kinship. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. Play an odd circle game with me. It's the Who Knew Each Other game. Once you start, you learn some remarkable things. I'll play around with you. I'll begin when the English industrialist Josiah Wedgwood hired an Everina Wollstonecraft as governess for his daughters. She, in turn, was the sister of Mary Wollstonecraft, the mother of modern feminism. And Mary Wollstonecraft married the anarchist writer William Godwin. He brings us back to Wedgwood. Wedgwood's son, Tom, was a disciple of Godwin and of his ideas on social reform. So was the poet Coleridge. Coleridge and Tom were close friends. Those two, in turn, were friends of the scientist Sir Humphrey Davy. Davy led them through experiments with laughing gas. The experiments got rowdy enough to draw public disapproval. Davy quit after the gas almost killed him. But by then, their horseplay had sown the seeds of modern anesthesiology. Tom Wedgwood's health began failing after that. His brother went to an old family friend for help in outfitting a house for ailing Tom. That friend was James Watt. And the trail has led us back to Josiah Wedgwood again. You see, when Watt was young, he joined Matthew Boulton in Birmingham to make steam engines. But he also met with literary people in Birmingham. Most of his life, he sat with a small and very high-powered group called the Lunar Society. But so did Boulton and Wedgwood. I'll close this circle here, though I could have gone off in many more directions. I could have circled into America. You see, Benjamin Franklin visited the Lunar Society now and then. Member William Small had once taught math to Thomas Jefferson in Virginia. Member Joseph Priestley was first to isolate oxygen. He ended his days in Pennsylvania. So you see how we play the game. It's fascinating on many levels. On one level, it makes great gossip, but on another, it lends a sudden insight. All at once, the remarkable vision of these people wells up from the chain of connection. You can begin the game anywhere. Start with the friendship between Mark Twain and the electrical pioneer Nikola Tesla. Begin with Rachmaninoff and helicopter inventor Igor Sikorsky working together. Our world is not shaped by specialists. It's given its form instead by people who see beyond the road they walk. The greats among us often do know each other. They become great because they're able to gaze through others' eyes as well as through their own. I'm John Lienhardt at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today, another Japanese lesson in patience and the meaning of creativity. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. Late in 1990, George Heilmeyer went to Nara, Japan to get an award for an old invention. 25 years before, he'd worked for RCA on television picture tubes. Picture tubes are big, clumsy things. They're the reason your TV set won't fit in the bookcase. Heilmeyer said, "Surely we can do better." He saw how to turn a field of liquid crystals on and off with a computer. Steady light flows through the tiny flickering crystals to create a picture. He gave birth to a new kind of screen, flat and thin. Today, those screens can give wonderfully clear, sharp images, and they draw very little power. RCA looked at its huge investment in ordinary picture tubes. Heilmeyer's inventions was, he says, more a threat to existing business than an opportunity. The Japanese took a longer view. They set out to recreate TV. You've seen an early form of those flat screens on laptop computers. Now in Tokyo you can buy a battery-powered TV set that lies flat in the palm of your hand. The full-blown technology still isn't ready for an everyday market. The problem is production. Those screens are very hard to make without flaws. You have to start 5 or 10 large high-resolution screens to get just one good one. So far, sets cost over $10,000, but engineers at Sharp and Hitachi will figure out how to bring them within our reach. Japanese businessmen have invested in a 10 to 20-year payoff. They've sustained themselves with a brisk trade in single-color computer screens. Meanwhile, they wait for large, flat color TV screens to mature. When they do, Japan will own one more building block in the control of high-tech electronics. So it was that the Japanese honored George Heilmeyer for his invention. Some might say he'd driven another nail into the coffin of American industrial power. He did not, of course. Impatience and greed for short-term gain drove those nails. The liquid crystal screen also teaches a lesson about creativity. We make a big mistake if we think those screens only copy an American invention. We see something else when we look more closely. We learn that creativity is recognition. Heilmeyer recognized a new possibility, of course, but so did the Japanese. They recognized it and they undertook long-term risk to claim it. And that's as much the stuff of creativity as invention is in the first place. I'm John Lienhardt at the University of Houston, where we're willing to look in new places to see how inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today, we wonder how to face change. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. A new policy came down one day in the 1970s at another university. From now on, it said, all our computing would be centralized. We couldn't have our own computers. The policy was firm, and it was a grievous misreading of the future. Few people saw the error. Today, of course, big central computers are specialized elephants. Personal computers have taken over most of our computing. Yet, even today, we struggle to see what the computer really is and how it should serve us. Experts concede that the PC actually hurt office productivity at first. Personal computers need personal expertise. We spent too much time misusing them. PC misuse has caused both errors and chaos. PCs have been around since 1981, and we have yet to figure out the best uses for them. We played this same drama the same way 100 years ago. The electric motor eventually had a huge impact, but we were equally slow to catch on to what it meant and how to use it. Before the electric motor, in the 1880s, factories were big cubicle buildings. That way, one large central steam engine could drive everything. A spider web of belts from the single engine drove shafts on every floor. It was like the spider web of terminals that later ran out from a central computer. We shaped factory buildings so the belts wouldn't get too long. First, we replaced the steam engine with one big electric motor. We didn't see how much flexibility we'd gain when each machine had its own motor. For a whole generation, we tried to fit new motors into old factories. It was 1920 before we let motors reshape factories into long, low-lying buildings. The first electric motors actually hurt productivity as much as they helped it. Now it's easy enough to be smart about the electric motor, and people in control of their own PCs can laugh when the rest of us dial our own phones and print out letters before we send them. But how many of us can see the truck coming? What new engines of our ingenuity already here will only reveal themselves fully in our grandchildren's lives? We find a clue to the riddle of change when we learn who has shaped our lives to the computer. It's been graduate students and employees. People with few vested interests working in the trenches can ignore the common wisdom and institutional planning. It is always such people who find the grain of the wood. Adapting to change means finding that same ability to let go of old ways and vested interest within ourselves. I'm John Lienhardt at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today, a witch doctor practices computer arithmetic. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. The scene is a remote Ethiopian village in 1940. A farmer offers his herd of 34 goats for sale. One goat is worth, say, $7. The villagers don't know how to multiply, so they call in a shaman. They asked him to set a fair price for the whole herd. The shaman digs 2 rows of small holes in the hard, dry earth. He reaches into his sack of pebbles and he goes to work. He puts 34 stones in the first hole on the left, 1 for each goat. He puts half that, or 17, in the next, half 17, or 8, in the next, and so on. He keeps dividing by 2 and dropping the remainder until the 6th hole has only 1 stone in it. Now he goes on to the other row. He puts 7 stones, the value of 1 goat, in the first hole. He puts twice that, or 14 stones, in the next hole, and so forth. Now his deliberations begin. He goes down the left-hand side, seeing whether the holes are good or evil. An even number of stones makes the hole evil. An odd number makes it good. 2 holes are good. The holes next to them in the right row contain 14 stones and 224 stones. He adds those numbers together. The result is the fair market value of the herd. It's $238. You and I know about multiplication, so we multiply the number of sheep by the value of a sheep, 7 times 34. When we do that, we get $238. But that's just what the shaman got. So what in the world was all the business with the holes? And would he get the right answer with different numbers? We try it with other numbers. It works every time. So we turn to a mathematician. He says it's not at all obvious. He puzzles for a long time. Finally, he sees it. This Ethiopian shaman has created a remarkable algorithm. All that business with the holes identifies the numbers in their binary form. That lets the shaman reduce multiplication to simple addition. He's multiplied just the way a digital computer does. Where did his method come from? How long have his forebears carried this rote tradition? An anonymous genius lurks somewhere in the haze of his history. So we look at our own multiplication and realize that we too use ritual to find out what 7 times 34 is. It makes no more sense to most people who use it than the shaman's holes. Our multiplication algorithm was also given us by an anonymous genius. He is also lost in rote tradition. So, how do we and that Ethiopian shaman differ? Well, very little, I reckon. Very little indeed. Of course, I wouldn't be surprised if he makes fewer mistakes than we do. I'm John Lienhardt at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today, let's look inside a 19th century scientist. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. The great experimental physicist John Tyndall holds an eerie fascination for me. He was born in Ireland in 1820. He began as a railroad engineer, and all his life he was drawn like a moth to the flame of romantic poetry. His physics lay squarely between those two powerful forces, between the material engines of external reality and the inner engines of the romantic mind. He made constant reference to the wild forces of nature. His physics grew lyrical when he described glaciers or the erratic behavior of flames. Listen to this curious sentence from the preface to his text on heat. I have tried to show how physicists passed from the world of the senses to a world where vision becomes spiritual, where principles are formed, and from which the explorer emerges with concepts to be approved or rejected as they coincide with sensible things. Tyndall bends our usual view of the scientific method to the language of the Romantic poets. The scientist, he says, starts out in the realm of the physical senses, but the creative act of shaping sense data into concept is a spiritual one. Then he must bring concept down off the mountain, back to the hard earth. There he must put it to the test. The Romantic poets shaped a new view of reality in the early 19th century. They told us that we create nature by dreaming nature. That sounds like tomfoolery at first. But scientists and inventors soon saw what the Romantics meant. Just as a poem or a machine is a reality first shaped in our minds, so too is our concept of nature. What, after all, is nature before our minds give it its shape? By the end of the 19th century, physics was an intellectual marvel. Tyndall's name doesn't stand with those who followed, with Maxwell, Boltzmann, or Planck, but he armed those giants. His astonishing eye for physical reality extended their outward vision. He and others like him also led science to the inner vision of the Romantics. In the end, that twofold view did indeed create nature by dreaming up a whole new edifice of natural law. Yet Tyndall was no fool. He also saw something the 20th century philosophers would soon tell us. No man-made edifice of natural law will ever bring us to absolute truth. He says, "Thus, having exhausted science and reached its very rim, the real mystery of existence still looms around us, and thus it will ever loom, ever beyond the bourne of man's intellect, giving the poets of successive ages just occasion to declare that we are such stuff as dreams are made of, and our little life is rounded by a sleep." I'm John Lienhardt at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today we ride a Ferris wheel. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. Here's a great line from Julian Jaynes' book, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. He says, "There is an awkward moment at the top of a Ferris wheel when, having come up the inside curvature where we are facing into a firm structure of confident girders, suddenly that structure disappears and we are thrust out into the sky for the outward curve down." Jaynes uses the Ferris wheel as a metaphor for that instant of uncertainty when a new truth reveals itself to us. He knows that the moment of discovery or of understanding holds a thrill of life and death terror. So, how did the Ferris wheel and its strange metaphorical power come into being? George Ferris, a young civil engineer, invented it. The new Eiffel Tower had been a nettle in Ferris' mind. The French seized our imagination with their crazy tower. Now America had to answer. By 1892, Ferris knew what to do. The French had driven a spire upward. He would create a great Ezekiel's wheel in the sky. The idea came to him in a Chicago chop house. He was dining with engineers working on the Chicago World's Fair. By supper's end, he'd sketched the whole thing. It was a 250-foot wheel with 36 passenger boxes. It would turn on a 45-foot axle. He would levitate 42 tons of steel into the air and spin it around. Ferris wouldn't use rigid spokes. Instead, he'd make a web of taut cables like a bicycle wheel. Of course, the other engineers didn't like it. It would fall over in the wind. It'd never carry its own weight. But Ferris prevailed. He built the wheel for the Chicago Fair, and it ran like a Swiss watch. When a hurricane swept the fairground, the wheel stood fast. Ferris died just 4 years later. He was only 38. He didn't live to see the spawn of his machine, the first roller coaster, the soul-testing, gut-wrenching machinery of today's amusement parks. Before he died, someone asked if he had other projects in mind. "I'd rather not say," he said. "Some of them might be too frightening." Ferris, it seems, finally saw that his great wheel did something more than competing with the French. It really did thrust the rider out into the sky for the outward curve down. So it is with good ideas. They rise suddenly out of the blue. They carry things we don't expect. No one thinks about Ferris wheels competing with the French today. Instead, that huge wheel and all that followed it speaks to us of thrill and motion and the very nature of new ideas. I'm John Lienhardt at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today we visit an art show. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. The Museum of Art in Katona, New York mounted an important exhibit in 1990. They called it The Technological Muse. The subtitle warns us what's coming: Affirmation and Ambivalence in American Machine Imagery, 1840 to 1990. Art and technology form an uneasy alliance. The Greeks used the same word, techne, to describe both. Techne means art and skill in making things. We've let the two pursuits separate themselves in our minds, yet they cannot be separated. Driving to work the other day, I heard Buxtehude's music played on a fine Danish-built organ. It was superb, but I came away perplexed. Where did genius lie? In Buxtehude, in the player, or in the man who created the organ? For that matter, which of the three would you call a technologist? Which would you call an artist? The fact is, they cannot be separated. So we walk through the exhibit. How do artists cope with the man-made material world when they're part of it? Here are two paintings of the same scene by an English landscape painter. The first, done in 1837, shows a lake, trees, mountains, and a woman playing with her child. 6 years later, we see smoke from a train in the background. The woman is gone, replaced with a man clearing the land. Thus, the museum tells us, modern technology entered the artist's mind on little cat feet. The first fruit of the Industrial Revolution tiptoes into paintings, transforming them subtly and profoundly. Photography follows with its eerie ability to heighten reality. By the 20th century, art has become a Greek chorus behind the engines of industrial change. Artists look at gears for their intrinsic beauty. They celebrate automobiles and dynamos. They lament the destruction of the land. They poke fun at bad technology. Here's something called an arms chair. It's an easy chair trimmed with 50 pistols. There is a 7-foot man made of TV sets. Through it all rises the artist's agony over so much technology that is no longer techne. In the end, these artists struggle with their own alter ego. Here's a wonderful picture of a machinist inside a Westinghouse turbine. He's adjusting the stator blades with a hammer. His face has the same quiet, rapt intensity that the artist knows so well. So, we're back to the exhibit title, The Technological Muse. I don't really believe the machine is a muse at all. For the artist, technology is really what he sees when he glimpses a mirror suddenly out of the corner of his eye. I'm John Lienhardt at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today, a new look at Ben Franklin's old kite. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. Few things loom larger in our American myths than Ben Franklin and electricity. The bare bones of the legend say that Franklin flew a kite into the sky, that he showed the world how to harness the wild electric forces of nature. Franklin began working on electricity after he heard a lecture about it in Scotland in 1743. 5 years later, he sent a letter on electricity to the Royal Society. In 1751, he published his book of electrical experiments in England. The English reaction to the book was generally favorable. It had a lot of important stuff in it. Franklin talked about his kite. He showed how to make lightning rods. He told us about negative and positive charge. Meanwhile, two French scientists were quarreling over other matters entirely. One had a student who'd written on electricity. When his foe saw Franklin's book, he arranged a French translation. That was pure malice. In the preface, he claimed no one but Franklin had done anything with electricity. The book took Franklin to center stage in France. Louis XV was fascinated. Lightning rods sprouted over Paris. Of course, King George was gravely unhappy with Franklin's politics. He angrily told his science advisor to declare that Franklin's lightning rod design was wrong. The advisor told him that the laws of nature could not be changed at royal pleasure. The king fired him directly. Franklin had troubles in America, too. After an earthquake in 1755, a cleric claimed Franklin had caused it by directing all that lightning into the ground. "Oh, there is no getting out of the mighty hand of God," he screamed at Franklin. The picture is clearer under history's lens. No doubt Franklin's huge presence in other areas helped his work. He was so visible as a revolutionary, as a writer, as a designer of America. When we look closely, we find that others did some of his electric work independently. A Czech priest probably invented the lightning rod first. A French lawyer certainly did the kite experiment before Franklin did. Yet Franklin organized ideas and drove them into the world. He gave them so much context. If some of his ideas weren't original, Franklin himself was always an original. He moved straight to the center of the entire 18th century stage. He redefined the stage while he was on it, and from that stage he called down lightning bolts of change on the whole Western world. I'm John Lienhardt at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.
This is the Engines of Our Ingenuity, made possible by the Friends of KUHF Houston.
Today, I receive a gift. The University of Houston's College of Engineering presents this series about the machines that make our civilization run and the people whose ingenuity created them. My father did a remarkable thing in 1939. We lived in St. Paul. My uncle was a doctor at the Mayo Clinic, 90 miles south. One day we drove down for a visit. My father was impulsive by nature. This day, on a lark, he said, "How would you like to fly back?" The ticket cost $9, a small fortune before World War II. I was stunned by the magnitude of that gift. I dreamt of flying since my first memory of thought. Now it was really going to happen. He sent me off into the sky with a streetcar token to get home and a nickel for a phone call, just in case. He sent me off in that great old workhorse, the Douglas DC-3. There I gained my first vision of Earth falling away. That's strong stuff after you've imagined it for so long. Years later, I learned about another gift from another father. One evening in 1874, a bishop of the United Brethren Church in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, brought a toy helicopter home to his two youngest sons. That was also a gift he could ill afford on his $1,000 a year salary. The bishop's name was Milton Wright. His two sons were Orville and Wilbur. Oddly enough, we didn't have real helicopters until long after those two brothers gave us the airplane. In fact, the first helicopter flew the same year I did. Orville Wright was still very much alive in 1939, and, like him, I wanted to build airplanes when I grew up. By 1951, I had both my degree and a job with Boeing Aircraft. Boeing put me to work drafting brackets for the B-52 bomber. That somehow fell short of dreams shaped by the buoyancy of DC-3s, crop dusters, and skywriters. My dream of flight was wed to the lightness of being, not to the weight of bombs. So I gave up Boeing. I set out to find new dreams, and I found them. My father's gift had done its work in my life. It told me that the unexpected can happen. It told me that dreams can be realized, but that they also grow and change. His impulsive gift showed me that we have both the power and the obligation to enrich each other's lives as he enriched mine, as Bishop Wright enriched the lives of his two sons, and as Orville and Wilbur finally enriched all of us. That gift opened my eyes to surprise. That's what the act of invention is. Invention is the gift of surprise. It is the evolution of the dream, and it waits for any of us able to open our eyes and able to see the gift. I'm John Lienhardt at the University of Houston, where we're interested in the way inventive minds work.